Late August 1944. General George S. Patton's Third Army is tearing across France, advancing faster than any mechanized force in military history. Deep inside German command bunkers, staff officers are calmly running the numbers. They calculate the massive American fuel consumption, study the shattered French railway networks, and simply wait. According to basic physics and standard military doctrine, an army moving this aggressively must inevitably outrun its own supply lines. Yet the American tanks keep rolling, the fuel keeps arriving. The German mathematics were practically flawless, but those calculations failed to account for a desperate, highly improvised experiment taking over the highways of France. The German staff officers were right to trust their math. The Allied breakout from Normandy was an operational triumph that immediately birthed a catastrophic logistical nightmare. By late August 1944, American and British armies were pushing eastward with staggering speed, but every mile gained stretched their only lifeline thinner. The major deep-water ports of France were either systematically destroyed or still heavily defended by German garrisons. Almost every bullet, ration, and drop of fuel supplying the front was still being dragged across the artificial harbors and beaches of Normandy. It was the ultimate paradox of victory. The faster the Allies pushed toward Germany, the closer they edged toward operational starvation. An advancing armored division could easily burn through tens of thousands of gasoline in a single day. Without that continuous flow, the mighty Sherman tanks were nothing more than stationary steel targets. Because retreating German forces and Allied bombers had thoroughly shattered the French railway system, the gap could not be bridged by train. The only remaining alternative was rubber, asphalt, and sheer human endurance. The American High Command implemented a massive, relentless, 24-hour truck loop, carving a dedicated one-way highway system out of the rural French road network. To keep this massive conveyor belt of supplies moving, the military turned to a workforce often sidelined in combat narratives. Nearly 75% of the drivers steering these 2.5-ton cargo trucks were African-American soldiers, serving in a strictly segregated army. They were ordered to drive day and night, navigating unfamiliar, damaged roads under extreme deadlines to keep the offensive alive. But how exactly did this improvised, grueling system manage to sustain the largest mechanized advance in history? And why did this desperate push to maintain momentum carry a hidden, devastating cost that would eventually threaten the very armies it was designed to save? To fully grasp the magnitude of the crisis unfolding in the last weeks of August 1944, one must look past the glowing headlines of the Allied newspapers. On paper, the war in Western Europe appeared to be rushing toward a swift and decisive conclusion. The German 7th Army had been effectively obliterated in the Falaise pocket. The grueling, bloody stalemate of the Normandy hedgerows was over, and American, British, and Canadian forces had finally broken into the open terrain of France. General George S. Patton's Third Army was executing a sweeping envelopment, driving toward the Seine River and Paris with a speed that shocked even his own commanders. The front lines were moving east at a rate of 20, sometimes 30 miles a day. It was a combat commander's dream. But in the quiet, smoke-filled planning tents of the Allied Logistical Command, this unprecedented victory was rapidly transforming into a geographical trap. The fundamental problem was not a lack of resources, but the unforgiving tyranny of distance. The entire Allied war machine was physically anchored to a small strip of coastline. Months earlier, military planners had correctly anticipated that sustaining a continental invasion would require deep-water ports to unload heavy cargo ships. The primary target was Cherbourg, a major port city situated at the northern tip of the Cotentin Peninsula. American forces had captured Cherbourg in late June, exactly as planned. But the German garrison, acting under strict orders from Berlin, had executed a masterpiece of industrial sabotage before surrender. Commanded by General Karl von Schlieben, German engineers systematically demolished the harbor. They blew up the massive lifting cranes, destroyed the electrical grids, collapsed the docks, and sank heavily mined block ships in the main navigation channels. The harbor was left a tangled, explosive graveyard of twisted steel and concrete. Allied engineers estimated it would take months to clear the wreckage and restore any meaningful capacity. Other major French ports in the region, Brest, Lorient, and Saint-Nazaire, were either too far west to be useful or heavily fortified and garrisoned by resolute German defenders who had been ordered to hold out to the last man. The massive port of Antwerp in Belgium, which could theoretically solve the entire supply crisis, remained firmly in German hands. Because these deep-water facilities were denied to them, the Allies were forced to rely almost exclusively on the original invasion beaches. By late August, the surviving artificial Mulberry Harbor at Arrow-Marsh, along with the sandy stretches of Omaha and Utah beaches, were still acting as the primary umbilical cord for millions of men. Massive transport ships from England would anchor offshore, transferring their cargo to smaller landing craft, which then navigated the tides to deposit crates directly on the sand. Through sheer industrial willpower, this improvised system was unloading thousands of tons of material every day. The beaches were quickly transformed into towering mountains of wooden crates, artillery shells, medical supplies, and millions of jerry cans filled with gasoline. The supplies were physically in France, but the combat vanguard was rapidly moving further and further away. By the end of August, the leading edges of the American advance were pushing 100, 200, and in some cases over 300 miles away from the Normandy coast. In a standard military environment, a logistical gap of this magnitude is bridged by rail. Trains are the lifeblood of any modern army, capable of moving thousands of tons of heavy material across vast distances with minimal fuel consumption. But the French railway network was completely useless to the advancing Americans, and the irony was that the Allies had destroyed it themselves. In the months leading up to D-Day, the Allied High Command had executed a massive, relentless bombing campaign known as the Transportation Plan. The objective was to isolate the Normandy beachhead by pulverizing the French rail infrastructure, preventing German reinforcements from reaching the coast. American and British heavy bombers systematically targeted marshalling yards, railway junctions, switching stations, and bridges. They dropped tens of thousands of tons of high explosives, obliterating tracks, and destroying an estimated 1,500 to 2,000 locomotives. The Transportation Plan was a resounding tactical success that crippled the German response in June. But by late August, that brilliant tactical success had morphed into a strategic nightmare. The Allies had locked themselves in a vast landscape devoid of functioning rail infrastructure. The tracks were twisted ribbons of steel, the bridges lay in ruins at the bottom of French rivers, and the surviving locomotives were scattered and broken. Rebuilding this network would take specialized engineering battalions months of painstaking labor. Without ports and without trains, the Allied command was forced to confront an unforgiving mathematical reality. An advancing field army is a ravenous organism. A single American infantry division fighting in World War II required roughly 600 to 700 tons of supplies every single day just to maintain combat effectiveness. An armored division, pushing aggressively across open country, required significantly more. The most critical, non-negotiable variable in this equation was gasoline. An M4 Sherman tank moving cross-country consumed roughly 1 to 1.5 gallons of fuel for every single mile traveled. A standard American armored division deployed hundreds of these tanks, alongside half-tracks, self-propelled artillery, and thousands of support vehicles. When Patton's Third Army and General Courtney Hodges' First Army were both advancing simultaneously, the daily gasoline requirement for the American forces alone spiked to hundreds of thousands of gallons a day. To move this fuel from the beaches to the front without trains, the military had to rely on standard cargo trucks. But this introduced a devastating logistical paradox. Trucks run on the exact same gasoline they are tasked with delivering. As the distance between the supply dumps in Normandy and the advancing tanks increased, the trucks had to drive further. The further they drove, the more fuel they burned from their own cargo just to make the round trip. By the time a standard supply convoy drove 300 miles to the front and 300 miles back, a massive percentage of its payload had been evaporated by its own engines. It was a logistical equation that could not be solved by sheer willpower. For every mile the combat troops advanced, the efficiency of their supply line degraded exponentially. By the final days of August, the breaking point arrived. The mountains of supplies sat completely idle on the Normandy beaches, while deep in the French countryside, the mighty engines of the American armored spearheads began to sputter and die. Tanks ground to a halt on the roads leading toward the German border, their fuel gauges resting on empty. Artillery batteries were forced to strictly ration their shells, severely limiting their ability to support infantry assaults. Deep inside the German command bunkers, the High Command observed this deceleration with calculated anticipation. Field Marshal Walter Model, tasked with stabilizing the crumbling Western Front, understood the mathematics of supply just as well as his Allied counterparts. The German strategy was no longer about winning decisive battles in France. It was about surviving until the Allied logistics tether inevitably snapped. They knew that standard military doctrine left the Americans with only one viable option: a mandatory tactical halt. According to every logistical manual ever written, an army in this position must stop its advance, dig into defensive positions, and wait weeks for the rear echelon engineers to clear the ports, repair the railways, and push the supply dumps forward. But a tactical halt was precisely what the Supreme Allied Commander, General Dwight D. Eisenhower, desperately wanted to avoid. Stopping meant giving the battered, retreating German army the most precious resource in war: time. Time to regroup, time to reinforce, and time to heavily fortify the formidable Siegfried Line along the German border. If the Allies stopped now, the momentum of the breakout would be permanently lost, and the war would inevitably drag on into the freezing, brutal winter of 1944, costing hundreds of thousands of additional lives. The situation presented a rigid, impossible conflict. The combat commanders demanded a relentless advance to break the German military before it could recover. The supply officers presented raw, undeniable math, proving that a continued advance was physically impossible. The standard military logistics doctrines, built on the assumption of functioning ports and railways, had officially failed. The equations had broken down. To prevent the complete collapse of the offensive and deny the German army the breathing room it desperately needed, Allied planners were backed into a corner. They had to bypass the destroyed railways, ignore the ruined ports, and invent a radical, unprecedented emergency measure overnight, utilizing the only resource they had left. On August 25, 1944, a group of desperate logistics officers from the advanced section of the communications zone gathered around a map of northern France and made a radical decision. If the French railway system was dead, they would simply have to build their own railway using asphalt and rubber. They devised a closed, continuous loop of vehicle traffic that would operate 24 hours a day, effectively turning standard cargo trucks into the rolling stock of a massive, improvised train. To make this work, the military had to completely seize control of the local infrastructure. Planners commandeered two parallel rural highway routes stretching from the Normandy beachheads eastward toward the supply depots near Chartres, and eventually pushing toward the Seine. The northern highway was strictly designated for fully loaded outbound convoys heading to the front. The southern highway was reserved exclusively for empty trucks returning to the beaches to reload. Military police were immediately dispatched to secure every major intersection along the route. They enacted a ruthless, non-negotiable ban on all other traffic. French civilians, local farmers, and even heavily armed Allied combat units were strictly forbidden from using these roads. If a general's jeep tried to cross the convoy line without authorization, the military police were ordered to stop it. To ensure drivers never lost their way, engineers nailed signs bearing solid red dots to trees, telegraph poles, and rural fences along the entire route. In railroad terminology, a red ball signified high-priority freight. Overnight, this emergency supply line officially became the Red Ball Express. But laying out a route on a map was only the first half of the problem. A highway is entirely useless without vehicles, and a fleet of trucks is utterly paralyzed without men to drive them. The Allied Transportation Corps was already stretched to its absolute breaking point, and the sheer scale of this new operation required thousands of drivers instantly. There was no time to draft and train specialized motor pool battalions in the United States and ship them across the Atlantic. The front lines were starving for fuel right now. Faced with a catastrophic labor shortage, the military resorted to a massive, immediate requisition of rear echelon troops already stationed in France. Supply clerks, bakers, cooks, stevedores, and infantry replacements were suddenly pulled from their standard duties. Platoon commanders walked through staging areas, pointing at men and asking a single question: who knew how to drive? Many of those who raised their hands had never operated anything larger than a civilian passenger car, yet they were immediately handed the keys to a 6x6, 2.5-ton cargo truck. Because of the rigid policies of the World War II American military, this sudden draft fell heavily on a specific demographic. The United States Armed Forces were strictly segregated, and military doctrine at the time routinely relegated black soldiers to service, labor, and supply battalions, barring most from frontline combat roles. Consequently, nearly 75% of the men suddenly ordered to take the wheel of the Red Ball Express were African American. These soldiers were abruptly thrust into the driver's seats of heavily loaded trucks, carrying highly volatile aviation fuel, high explosive artillery shells, and massive crates of combat rations. They were given a hasty briefing, a destination they had never seen, and orders to get moving immediately. The pressure from the high command was absolute. The trucks could not stop, and the convoys could not slow down. It was a colossal gamble. The Allied command was throwing tens of thousands of non-combat troops into a completely untested, massive improvised loop with absolutely zero preparation time. There was no established doctrine for an operation of this magnitude, no precedent for managing this volume of continuous road traffic, and no understanding of how the human body would react to the extreme demands being placed upon it. As the first convoys roared to life on the Normandy coast and the heavy tires hit the red-dotted highways, the emergency measure was officially in motion. But the moment the route opened, it instantly transformed into a grueling, non-stop physical trial that nobody in the Allied command was fully prepared to survive. The moment a driver climbed into the cab of a standard GM-CCCW 2.5-ton cargo truck, he was instantly enveloped in a hostile, unforgiving environment. There was no power steering. There was no air conditioning, no sound insulation, and no synchronized transmission in the lower gears. The seats were stiff, unforgiving canvas pulled tightly over metal frames, offering absolutely zero shock absorption against the shattered, pothole-riddled roads of northern France. The engine, a heavy-duty inline six-cylinder, sat just inches away from the driver's boots, radiating immense heat through the floorboards and filling the cramped metal cab with the constant, nauseating fumes of unburned hydrocarbons and hot oil. To operate this machine required significant, exhausting physical exertion. Every turn of the large, rigid steering wheel demanded serious upper body strength, especially when the vehicle was fighting its way out of a muddy rut or swerving to avoid the crater of an artillery shell. Shifting gears required the complex, physically demanding technique of double clutching, forcing the driver to expertly match the engine's revolutions to the transmission's speed, just to prevent the heavy gears from grinding into metal shards. This was the raw, brutal mechanical reality of the vehicle that the Allied High Command was now relying on to save the war. And the men ordered to drive them were about to be pushed far beyond the limits of human endurance. Almost immediately after the Red Ball Express routes were officially carved into the map, the military's established rulebook for convoy operations was completely thrown out the window. According to strict Quartermaster Corps doctrine, a heavy truck convoy was supposed to operate with immaculate discipline. The official speed limit was set at a rigid 25 miles per hour. Trucks were ordered to maintain a precise 60-yard interval between vehicles to prevent chain reaction collisions and to mitigate the damage from potential enemy airstrikes. Drivers were legally mandated to work in shifts, ensuring they received adequate rest before getting back behind the wheel. But the reality of the front lines in late August of 1944 dictated entirely different terms. General George S. Patton's Third Army was not waiting for standard operating procedures. They were demanding thousands of tons of supplies every single day, and the logistics officers were fully aware that 25 miles per hour simply was not going to cut it. The pressure rolling down the chain of command was absolute, uncompromising, and ruthlessly straightforward. Keep the trucks moving, no matter the cost, and do not let the armored spearheads run dry. Faced with this impossible mandate, the men on the ground initiated a massive, silent rebellion against the military's mechanical constraints. Every cargo truck in the Allied motor pool was factory-equipped with an engine governor, a small mechanical device installed on the carburetor specifically designed to restrict the engine's maximum revolutions and prevent the truck from exceeding the official speed limit. But within hours of the Red Ball Express opening, Army mechanics and resourceful drivers, armed with basic toolkits, screwdrivers, and wrenches, began systematically dismantling and bypassing these governors. It was a court-martial offense, a direct violation of standing orders, but the military police stationed along the route largely looked the other way. The result was instantaneous and terrifying. Heavy cargo trucks, originally engineered for slow, steady transport, were suddenly roaring down the narrow, twisting country roads of the French countryside at 40, 50, and sometimes even 60 miles per hour. The 60-yard interval vanished immediately, replaced by a dense, chaotic, bumper-to-bumper stampede of steel. The drivers were no longer operating a disciplined military supply line. They were actively participating in a frantic, high-speed highway race, maneuvering a massive, continuous mechanical snake pushing its way eastward. This reckless velocity was severely compounded by a complete collapse of the mandated work-rest cycles. The original plan for the Red Ball Express called for 2 men to be assigned to every truck, allowing them to alternate driving shifts and catch a few hours of sleep in the passenger seat while the vehicle kept moving. But the sudden, explosive scale of the operation quickly exposed a desperate labor shortage. There simply were not enough men to fill the passenger seats. As a result, thousands of drivers found themselves making the punishing, hundreds-of-mile round trip entirely alone. The official shifts were completely ignored, as 12-hour rotations stretched into 24 hours, and then frequently bled into grueling 48-hour marathons behind the wheel. Drivers were operating in a state of severe, clinical sleep deprivation. They ate their standard-issue cold sea rations out of tin cans with one hand, while keeping their other hand firmly on the vibrating steering wheel and their foot completely pinned to the floorboard. The physiological toll of this extreme exhaustion was devastating. Men literally taped their eyelids open, drank gallons of bitter, tepid coffee, and continuously slapped their own faces just to remain conscious. They experienced severe highway hypnosis, a dangerous psychological phenomenon where the brain, numbed by the drone of the engine and the endless gray ribbon of asphalt, simply stops processing reality. Drivers frequently reported vivid, terrifying hallucinations, swerving wildly to avoid phantom German tanks, imaginary concrete barricades, or non-existent pedestrians that their exhausted minds had suddenly projected directly onto the empty road ahead. If navigating this high-speed, sleep-deprived chaos during the day was a grueling trial, driving the Red Ball Express at night was a descent into absolute psychological terror. Despite the fact that the German military was in full retreat across France, the night skies were far from safe. The Luftwaffe, though severely battered and largely absent during the daylight hours, still maintained a lethal presence after the sun went down. German fighter bombers, including Messerschmitt 109s and Focke-Wulf 190s, frequently prowled the airspace above the highways, scanning the darkness for the telltale glow of American headlights. To minimize the threat of these devastating strafing runs, the Allied command enforced a strict, non-negotiable blackout protocol along the entire route. Standard headlights were completely forbidden. Instead, drivers were forced to rely on cat eyes, heavily restricted covers placed over the headlamps that allowed only a tiny, barely visible horizontal sliver of light to escape. This meant that drivers hurtling down unfamiliar French farm roads at 40 miles per hour in the dead of night were doing so in almost total, suffocating darkness. The tiny slits of light provided virtually no illumination of the road ahead. Instead, drivers had to rely entirely on the faint, glowing red taillight of the truck immediately in front of them. The entire convoy moved as a blind, interconnected organism. If the lead truck missed a sharp curve in the darkness and plunged into a ditch, the three trucks following immediately behind it, unable to see the hazard and reacting too slowly due to exhaustion, would frequently follow it straight into the dirt. To make matters worse, the massive, continuous volume of heavy vehicle traffic quickly pulverized the macadam surface of the rural French roads, churning up a thick, choking cloud of white dust that hung over the highway like a dense fog. The dust was so impenetrable that it coated the windshields in a thick layer of grit, completely rendering the windshield wipers useless and forcing drivers to lean their heads out the side windows just to see the taillight ahead of them, breathing in the abrasive dirt until they coughed up dark phlegm. Some drivers resorted to wearing their bulky, restrictive, standard-issue gas masks while driving, just to filter out the relentless dust, adding a layer of claustrophobia to the nightmare of the night shift. While this chaotic, desperate struggle against human exhaustion played out on the dark roads of France, a completely different type of tension was building deep inside the heavily fortified headquarters of the German High Command. Far to the east, inside the Situation Rooms of OB West, Field Marshal Walter Model and his senior staff officers, including the meticulously analytical General Siegfried Westphal, were staring intently at their situation maps, completely bewildered by the intelligence reports flooding in from the front. The German general staff was highly educated in the strict, mathematical science of military logistics. They understood the immutable laws of supply and demand. They knew exactly how much fuel and ammunition a single American armored division required to operate for 24 hours. They knew the precise capacity of a standard cargo train, and they knew, with absolute certainty, that the French railway network behind the American lines was completely and utterly destroyed. They had verified the ruined bridges, the shattered switching yards, and the obliterated locomotives. Therefore, according to the rigid, highly structured doctrines taught at the German war academies, the rapid American advance was a physical impossibility. General Patton's tanks were currently positioned deep in the French interior, threatening the critical fortress city of Metz, hundreds of miles away from the only functioning supply beaches in Normandy. The German mathematics dictated that the Americans must have run out of gasoline days ago. The High Command confidently expected the Third Army to sputter to a complete halt, providing the retreating Wehrmacht with the precious weeks they desperately needed to reorganize, dig trenches, and man the concrete fortifications of the Siegfried Line. Yet, every single morning, new reports arrived indicating that the American vanguard had captured another town, secured another bridge, and pushed another 10 miles closer to the borders of the Reich. The math simply did not add up. German intelligence officers frantically analyzed intercepted radio communications, desperately searching for an explanation. They picked up scattered references to something called the Red Ball, but the sheer scale of the operation defied their strategic comprehension. The German military apparatus, which relied heavily on a mixture of modern rail networks and traditional horse-drawn transport for its own logistics, could not fathom the concept of an army attempting to sustain a massive, multi-army offensive utilizing nothing but unarmored, 2.5-ton trucks driving in a continuous loop. They assumed the Americans were either employing a massive fleet of undiscovered heavy cargo aircraft, had secretly laid a massive underground pipeline right behind the advancing tanks, or were simply running on fumes and bluffing their way forward. The rigidity of German military doctrine completely blinded them to the reality of the situation. They were waiting patiently for the absolute laws of physics and operational science to assert themselves and stop the American advance. They failed to realize that the Allied command was not solving the logistical equation. They were simply brute forcing their way through it, violently overriding the laws of supply by substituting careful planning with raw, unfiltered horsepower, catastrophic mechanical wear, and the immense suffering of thousands of exhausted drivers. But the German staff officers were not entirely wrong to trust their mathematics, because out on the French highways, the sheer physical toll of this brute force approach was beginning to manifest in highly destructive, localized catastrophes. The Red Ball Express was not a smoothly running conveyor belt. It was a violent, chaotic war zone where the primary enemy was friction, heat, and gravity. A cargo truck is fundamentally a machine defined by strict engineering limits, and every single one of those limits was being violently exceeded on a daily basis. The GMC CCKW was meticulously designed by engineers in Detroit to safely carry a payload of 5,000 pounds. However, the desperate quartermaster units loading the vehicles back at the Normandy beachheads were operating under extreme pressure from the front. They routinely ignored the official payload limits, cramming 8,000, 10,000, and sometimes even 12,000 pounds of high-explosive artillery shells, dense crates of K-rations, and heavy, sloshing jerry cans of 80-octane fuel into the wooden beds of the trucks. This extreme, systemic overloading completely altered the physics of the vehicle. The heavy loads drastically shifted the truck's center of gravity upward, making the vehicle incredibly top-heavy and dangerously prone to violent rollovers on the sharp, heavily cambered curves of the French rural roads. Furthermore, the immense weight overwhelmed the truck's braking system. The mechanical drum brakes, designed to stop a much lighter vehicle traveling at 25 miles per hour, simply could not dissipate the massive kinetic energy of a 10,000-pound load hurtling downhill at 50 miles per hour. The brake shoes quickly overheated, faded, and frequently failed completely, leaving panicked drivers frantically downshifting and praying the transmission would slow them down before they rear-ended the convoy ahead. But the most vulnerable point of failure in this brutal mechanical equation was the rubber. The trucks rode on heavy-duty, non-directional mud and snow tires, heavily treaded and designed for off-road traction, not sustained high-speed highway driving. The combination of massive, unauthorized cargo weight, extreme speeds, and the scorching surface temperature of the asphalt created immense, localized friction. The rubber literally began to melt and delaminate from the heat. To make matters worse, the dual rear tires of the trucks acted like massive vacuums, constantly picking up jagged rocks, sharp pieces of shrapnel, and twisted metal debris from the damaged roads, wedging the hazards tightly between the tires where they violently chewed through the thick rubber sidewalls. The result was a devastating, continuous epidemic of high-speed blowouts. When a front tire blew out on a heavily overloaded truck traveling at 50 miles per hour, the steering wheel would violently snap out of the exhausted driver's hands, instantly plunging the vehicle off the narrow shoulder and into the deep drainage ditches that lined the French highways. The route quickly became a linear, chaotic graveyard of American industrial might. The ditches along the designated highways were heavily littered with the twisted, smoking carcasses of overturned trucks, their precious cargo of food, medical supplies, and highly volatile fuel violently scattered across the dirt, often igniting in massive, localized fireballs that threatened to consume the rest of the convoy. In a standard military operation, a wrecked or broken down truck would be carefully towed back to a heavily equipped rear echelon motor pool, for proper evaluation, repair, and eventual redeployment. But the Red Ball Express afforded absolutely no time for such logistical luxuries. The entire operation was defined by an extreme, unyielding forward momentum. A truck sitting idle on the shoulder of the road was not just a mechanical failure, it was a direct threat to the survival of the frontline infantry. To combat this staggering rate of mechanical attrition, the Army deployed specialized ordnance maintenance companies, highly mobile units of expert mechanics, tasked with patrolling the route in light jeeps and heavy wreckers. These mechanics operated under a ruthless, highly efficient triage protocol. When they encountered a disabled truck, they had mere minutes to make a critical assessment. If the engine had thrown a rod, the transmission was shattered, or the frame was violently bent from a rollover, the truck was immediately classified as a total loss. It would not be towed, it would not be saved. Instead, it became an involuntary, on-the-spot donor. The mechanics would swarm the dead vehicle like vultures, executing a frantic, highly aggressive process known as cannibalization. Working directly on the dirt shoulder of the highway, amidst the deafening roar and choking dust of the passing convoys, they rapidly stripped the wreck of anything even remotely useful. They ripped out carburetors, salvaged spark plugs, unbolted heavy axles, drained the radiator fluid, and violently pried off any remaining intact tires. Within less than an hour, the once vital cargo truck was reduced to a hollow, stripped-down skeleton of useless steel, left to rust in the French ditch, while its vital organs were rushed up the road to be hastily bolted into 3 other limping trucks to keep them in the fight. The sheer volume of this roadside cannibalization was staggering, turning the supply route into a highly visible, mechanical slaughterhouse. Drivers speeding past the wreckage were forced to look at the twisted, stripped remains of the vehicles, a constant, grim reminder of the razor-thin margin between survival and disaster on the road. As August bled into September, the sheer, unprecedented scale of the operation began to fundamentally alter the physical environment of northern France. The Red Ball Express was no longer just a designated supply route on a map. It had evolved into a massive, invading force of continuous noise, severe vibration, and industrial destruction. The quaint, quiet stone villages and rural farming communities that lined the highway network were subjected to a relentless 24-hour sensory assault. The heavy, low-frequency drone of thousands of inline-6 engines operating at maximum revolutions never stopped. The constant, heavy impact of the overloaded tires violently shaking the macadam roads caused the centuries-old stone walls of French houses to literally crack and crumble from the sustained seismic vibration. The air in these towns was permanently choked with the thick, acrid smell of burning rubber, leaking oil, and the sharp chemical tang of unburned 80-octane fuel. The drivers themselves, the vast majority of them African-American soldiers bearing the absolute brunt of this extreme physical labor, began to resemble ghosts. They were completely covered from head to boot in a thick, uniform layer of white, powdery road dust that clung to their sweat, deeply outlining the exhausted, bloodshot red lines of their eyes. They suffered from severe weight loss due to the irregular, terrible diet of cold combat rations eaten on the move. Many developed chronic back pain and severe kidney issues from the relentless, bone-jarring bouncing of the unsprung metal seats. They were breathing in massive, unhealthy doses of carbon monoxide, leaking from the damaged exhaust manifolds of their overworked trucks. Yet, despite the immense physical deterioration, despite the constant threat of high-speed rollovers, and despite the terrifying, blinding darkness of the night shifts, they kept their foot heavily on the accelerator, pushing the massive steel conveyor belt forward through sheer, unimaginable willpower. To the outside world, to the newspaper correspondents filing optimistic reports back in London and New York, and to the frontline combat commanders watching the critical fuel finally arrive at their staging areas, the massive, chaotic truck loop appeared to be a brilliant, unquestionable triumph of American logistical ingenuity. It looked like a miraculous, improvised solution that had successfully bridged the impossible gap between the Normandy beaches and the advancing tanks. But beneath the surface of this apparent operational miracle, a much darker, highly destructive reality was rapidly unfolding. The entire system was fundamentally unsustainable. The trucks were literally eating themselves alive, grinding their gears to dust, shredding their vital rubber tires on the broken asphalt, and completely destroying their own internal engines through massive overheating and a complete lack of basic preventative maintenance. The operation was not a permanent solution to the logistical crisis. It was a desperate, incredibly violent war of attrition against their own mechanical equipment. They were keeping the tanks moving, but the underlying, unforgiving physics of the operation were quietly, inevitably, destroying the very fleet that was keeping the army alive. The German staff officers sitting in their bunkers had not been wrong. Their mathematics were merely delayed. By early September, the Red Ball Express was slamming headfirst into the exact geographical realities the Wehrmacht had calculated. As the Allied vanguard shattered the German defenses and pushed past Paris toward the Rhine, the improvised truck loop stretched out to a staggering 400 miles. At this extreme distance, the fundamental laws of physics and fuel consumption began to violently assert themselves. The supply snake was finally beginning to eat its own tail. A standard 2.5-ton cargo truck hauling gasoline to the front lines now had to travel up to 800 miles round trip. To make that grueling journey, the truck's engine burned through massive quantities of the very fuel it was assigned to deliver. For every 100 gallons of gasoline pumped into the trucks at the Normandy beaches, a devastating percentage evaporated in their own exhaust pipes, just to transport the remaining fraction to the armored divisions. The Allied command was literally burning hundreds of thousands of gallons of fuel in a desperate attempt to move a few thousand gallons to the fighting front. It was an equation of diminishing returns that was mathematically unsustainable. This extreme distance drastically accelerated the mechanical slaughter. The hasty roadside cannibalization of wrecked vehicles was no longer sufficient to keep the fleet moving. The most critical point of failure was the rubber. The high-speed runs on heavily overloaded axles over pulverized French roads triggered a catastrophic tire shortage. By mid-September, the Red Ball Express was wearing out and destroying tens of thousands of tires a week. Supply depots in England were completely drained of replacements, and urgent radiograms were sent directly to Washington, begging for emergency airlifts. Engines, deprived of oil changes and run at maximum revolutions for days on end, vibrated themselves to pieces. The transport system was dissolving from within. As the flow of usable fuel reaching the front inevitably choked, the logistical crisis triggered an internal war among the Allied commanders. There was simply not enough gasoline surviving the journey to feed both the American and British advances. General George S. Patton, commanding the Third Army in the South, and Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, commanding the 21st Army Group in the North, engaged in a ruthless, bitter struggle for priority. It was no longer just about fighting the Germans. It was about stealing from each other. In sheer desperation, commanders authorized their men to hijack their own supply lines. Rogue supply officers set up unauthorized checkpoints, forcibly rerouting Red Ball convoys destined for rival units. Trucks were commandeered by Allied soldiers, their precious fuel diverted in the dead of night to keep specific tanks rolling while neighboring divisions were left completely dry. The Red Ball Express had proven it was never a permanent solution. It was a violent, temporary stopgap that was rapidly destroying itself just to buy the combat armies a few extra days of momentum. By late September, this fragile, self-cannibalizing system was stretched to its absolute breaking point. It was balancing on a razor's edge of total collapse, operating with zero margin for error. And that is exactly when the skies over northern France began to darken and the heavy autumn rains began to fall. The autumn rains of October 1944 did not just slow the Allied advance, they physically dissolved the ground beneath it. The torrential downpours turned the unpaved supply dumps, hastily established in open French pastures and dirt clearings, into impassable lakes of glutinous mud. For the Red Ball Express, this weather shift was a death blow. A truck fleet that relied entirely on speed and continuous momentum was suddenly forced to wade through thick, freezing sludge. The physical degradation of the vehicles, previously masked by the dry summer heat, was now disastrously exposed. The heavy mud and snow tires on the cargo trucks had been worn completely bald, their deep rubber treads sheared off by weeks of high-speed friction on the abrasive macadam highways. With no traction left, the 2.5-ton trucks simply spun their wheels, sinking up to their heavy steel axles in the muck. Convoys that once roared across the countryside were reduced to a crawling, agonizing grind. Drivers were forced to leap into the freezing mud, utilizing winches, wooden planks, and sheer physical force just to free their vehicles, burning through clutches and destroying already fragile transmissions in the process. Brake pads, worn down to the bare metal rivets, offered no stopping power on the slick, rain-swept roads, sending top-heavy trucks sliding uncontrollably into deep ditches. Inside the uninsulated canvas cabs, the human toll reached its absolute zenith. The men gripping the steering wheels, nearly 75% of whom were African-American soldiers, were now operating in a state of advanced physical collapse. They were driving in soaking wet uniforms, shivering violently without heaters, and staring through windshields obscured by relentless rain. These men were navigating a brutal paradox. They were the absolute lifeblood of the Allied war machine, yet they served in a strictly segregated military that often treated them as expendable labor, subjecting them to systemic racism, inferior billeting, and constant harassment from the very military police ordered to protect the route. Despite this, they fought through blinding fatigue, dangerous road conditions, and the ever-present threat of German strafing runs to keep the supply line breathing. By the time the autumn rains fully set in, these drivers had already moved an unfathomable 400,000 tons of supplies across France. But human willpower could no longer override mechanical death and the laws of nature. This massive logistical seizure happened at the exact worst possible moment for the combat troops at the front. The German army had finally stopped retreating. As the exhausted, mud-soaked American supply trucks struggled to cover the final miles, the Allied vanguard slammed headfirst into the West Wall, known to the Americans as the Siegfried Line. This was a formidable, dense network of reinforced concrete pillboxes, interlocking machine gun nests, and thousands of jagged anti-tank obstacles known as dragon's teeth, stretching along the German border. The days of rapid, sweeping armored advances across open country were violently over. To crack this massive defensive wall, the infantry and armored divisions required a colossal volume of heavy artillery, high-explosive shells, and sustained fuel for prolonged, static engagements. The combat commanders demanded an immediate, massive surge in tonnage to break the German fortifications before winter. But the pipeline was empty. The Red Ball Express, stretched across 400 miles of ruined, muddy roads, was in its death throes. The daily tonnage delivered to the front plummeted drastically. Artillery batteries, staring down heavily fortified German bunkers, were suddenly ordered to ration their shells to a handful of rounds per day. Tanks sat idle in the freezing rain, their engines silent, waiting for fuel convoys that were hopelessly bogged down hundreds of miles to the rear. The tension across the chain of command reached a breaking point. The frontline troops faced the most brutal, entrenched resistance of the entire European campaign, and the logistical network standing behind them was physically shattering in the mud. The continuous, impossible conveyor belt of rubber and steel had finally snapped. The sheer brute force that had carried the Allies across France was exhausted, leaving one final, crucial question hanging over the freezing battlefields. Had this massive, desperate sacrifice bought the combat armies enough time, or had the entire system destroyed itself for nothing? The answer lay in the geography they had already conquered. In the end, the German staff officers sitting in their distant bunkers had been absolutely right. Their logistical mathematics were flawless. The laws of physics, distance, and fuel consumption could not be outrun or ignored indefinitely. The American advance did eventually grind to a halt in the freezing mud of the German border, precisely as enemy doctrine had predicted. The mighty armored spearheads were forced to stop, dig in, and wait for the deep-water ports to be cleared and the shattered railway networks to be meticulously rebuilt. The logistical tether snapped, just as the German generals knew it must. But the German high command had made one fatal miscalculation. They had underestimated the sheer, destructive willpower the Allied command was willing to unleash to delay that inevitable collapse. The Red Ball Express was never designed to be a permanent, sustainable supply line. From the moment the first overloaded truck hit the asphalt in late August, the operation was a calculated, self-destructive sacrifice. The Allies traded the absolute destruction of their own transport fleet, the obliteration of tens of thousands of tires, and the agonizing physical exhaustion of their drivers for one irreplaceable resource: time. That brutal, improvised conveyor belt held off the mathematical reality of logistics for exactly 81 days. In that incredibly narrow window, the relentless flow of fuel and ammunition allowed the combat divisions to completely shatter the German defensive lines across northern France. They chased the retreating Wehrmacht across the Seine, liberated Paris, and pushed the front line hundreds of miles eastward, denying the enemy the chance to regroup and establish a defense in depth on French soil. The trucks destroyed themselves, but they bought enough geography to ensure that when the winter stalemate finally arrived, it was fought on the borders of the Reich, not in the hedgerows of Normandy. This grueling episode strips away the romanticized veneer of the European campaign. The breakout across France is rarely remembered for the thousands of burned-out cargo trucks littering the ditches, or the sleep-deprived, dust-covered African-American soldiers who kept their feet pinned to the accelerators. Yet, their silent, grinding ordeal reveals the true nature of modern mechanized warfare. Victory in the 20th century was not solely determined by tactical brilliance, the armor plating of a tank, or the courage of the infantryman holding a rifle. It was dictated by the brutal, unglamorous mathematics of supply. An army is only as lethal as the fuel in its tanks and the artillery shells in its breeches. When the established systems failed, victory demanded a workforce willing to endure extreme, punishing labor to manually force the war machine forward. The ultimate paradox of the Red Ball Express is that it did not secure the Allied breakout by functioning as an efficient, sustainable supply line, but by operating as a deliberate, calculated mechanism of self-destruction. It successfully defied the flawless mathematics of the German High Command, not by solving the logistical equation, but by brutally sacrificing its own infrastructure, burning through thousands of engines, shredding irreplaceable tires, and grinding its exhausted men into the dust to purchase the one asset the combat armies desperately required. In the unforgiving calculus of 1944, this improvised operation won the War of Logistics precisely because it traded itself entirely for momentum, guaranteeing the rapid liberation of France at the absolute cost of its own mechanical and human survival.